You've been told that Winston Churchill saved Britain, that his defiance, his voice, his sheer willpower turned the tide of the Second World War, that when the world was collapsing, he stood alone, cigar in hand, roaring against the darkness. And that's true, at least the part about him standing alone. But what you've not been told is that while Churchill won the war on the battlefield, he lost it in the bank vault. That behind the smoke, the speeches, and the myth of bulldog courage, Churchill made financial decisions that quietly bankrupted the British Empire. Decisions whose consequences still shape your wallet, your taxes, and your country's position in the world today. This isn't a story of tanks or battles. It's a story of debt, desperation, and the quiet death of empire. Because here's the dark truth. Britain didn't just lose colonies after World War II, it lost its financial sovereignty. And the man who helped make that happen was Winston Churchill, the very symbol of British pride and resilience. So how did a war hero become the architect of economic ruin? Let's rewind the tape. It's 1919. The Great War has just ended. Europe is shattered. Millions dead, empires gone, currencies in chaos. Britain, once the centre of the world's financial system, has spent 4 long years burning money like coal, and now it's broke. Its currency, the pound sterling, has collapsed by more than 1/3 against the dollar. Prices have doubled. The gold reserves that once made London the financial capital of the world have been drained. But Britain has something else: pride. The pride of empire. The pride of being the country that ruled the seas, printed the world's reserve currency, and lent to everyone else. And that pride demanded one thing: restoration. Britain had to get back to the gold standard, the symbol of financial strength. There was just one problem: the math didn't work. To return the pound to its pre-war gold value, Britain would need to make its currency artificially strong. That meant deflation, high unemployment, lower wages, a deliberate national squeeze. And who was the man who would make that choice? Winston Churchill. In 1925, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Churchill made a fateful announcement. He was bringing Britain back to gold. The pound would once again be as good as gold. It sounded noble, it sounded patriotic, it sounded like Britain reclaiming its throne. But it was an illusion. By returning to gold at the old pre-war exchange rate, Churchill essentially overvalued the pound by 10 to 20%. British exports suddenly became too expensive. Industry couldn't compete, wages had to fall, unemployment soared. Churchill's own economic advisor, John Maynard Keynes, begged him not to do it. Keynes wrote a scathing pamphlet titled The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, warning that the decision would cripple British industry and cause mass misery. But Churchill didn't listen. He wasn't thinking like an economist. He was thinking like an aristocrat, a man obsessed with prestige. To him, abandoning the gold standard would mean admitting weakness. So he chose pride over pragmatism, image over reality, and Britain paid the price. The coal miners were the first to feel it. When their wages were cut to restore competitiveness, they went on strike. That strike turned into the General Strike of 1926, one of the biggest industrial conflicts in British history. The entire country shut down. Churchill called it a challenge to the British nation. But in reality, it was a revolt against his policies. The working class rebelling against being sacrificed on the altar of an overvalued currency. That decision in 1925 would haunt Britain for decades. It made the country weaker, not stronger. It hollowed out industry, deepened inequality, and turned the empire into a debtor pretending to be a creditor. And yet, a decade later, when the world collapsed again, Churchill returned, this time not as a financial architect, but as the savior of democracy. But wars aren't fought with words or bravery. They're fought with money. And by 1939, Britain didn't have any. When World War II began, Britain's financial position was already fragile. The empire was global, but its cash flow wasn't. The gold reserves were thin, the foreign investments were gone, and the country's debts from the last war still hadn't been paid off. Within months of fighting Germany, Britain was hemorrhaging money. It had to import food, oil, weapons, and it had to pay for them in dollars, not pounds. By 1940, the Bank of England was nearly empty. The empire's gold was secretly shipped to Canada for safekeeping. The British Treasury knew that without massive help, the country would go bankrupt before it could win the war. And that's exactly what happened. Enter Franklin D. Roosevelt and the United States. Roosevelt wasn't just offering friendship, he was offering credit, but at a price. The US didn't simply hand over money out of kindness, it demanded something far more valuable: control. In 1940, the cash and carry policy forced Britain to sell off its overseas assets to pay for supplies. Britain sold its American investments, shipping lines, patents, anything it could liquidate. Decades of empire wealth were auctioned off to keep the war machine running. Then came Lend-Lease in 1941, the supposed act of American generosity. Roosevelt promised to lend weapons and supplies to Britain to fight the Nazis, but this wasn't a gift, it was a financial leash. Churchill publicly called it the most unsordid act in history. But in private, he knew the truth. The agreement meant that Britain would fight on credit, and that after the war, it would owe the United States not just money, but loyalty. By 1945, Britain's overseas assets had been stripped. Its gold reserves had evaporated. Its industries were bombed out. It had traded centuries of economic dominance for 6 years of survival. And when the guns finally fell silent, Churchill stood in ruins, both literal and financial. But the story doesn't end with victory, it ends with humiliation. Because after the war, when Churchill was voted out of office, his successor Clement Attlee faced a nightmare. Britain owed over $4 billion to the United States, the equivalent of more than $200 billion today. To pay it back, Attlee had to go begging. In 1946, the British government signed a loan agreement with Washington that would take 50 years to repay. The final payment wasn't made until 2006. Britain had become what it once ruled, a debtor nation. And beneath the polite diplomacy and talk of special relationship, a new global order was forming, one where the dollar replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. Churchill didn't just lose Britain's empire, he helped hand it over. Let's pause for a moment, because this isn't just a story about the past. It's the blueprint for how financial empires die and how new ones are born. The British Empire didn't fall because of revolution. It fell because it ran out of money, because pride blinded its leaders, because image mattered more than solvency. Sound familiar? Nations today, including the one you live in, are repeating the same cycle: printing, borrowing, posturing, pretending strength while mortgaging the future. Every empire dies in the same way, first in arrogance, then in debt, and finally in dependency. And Churchill's story is the perfect microcosm of that descent. Let's go back again. After the war, Churchill returned to power in 1951, older, slower, but still determined to restore Britain's greatness. He promised stability, strength, and continuity. But what did he actually inherit? A broken financial system, a shrinking empire, and a balance sheet drowning in red ink. The United States now dominated global finance through the Bretton Woods system, where all currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. In other words, the world had a new gold standard, an American one. Churchill, once the champion of British gold supremacy, now found himself subordinate to Washington. He could no longer set the terms of trade, dictate global finance, or act as lender of last resort. The Bank of England was a shadow of its former self. London's financial might had been replaced by Wall Street's. But Churchill refused to see it. He clung to the illusion of empire. He poured money into defending the pound's prestige, maintaining overseas garrisons, and propping up colonies that no longer paid for themselves. And the result? Inflation, austerity, and economic stagnation. The British people were rationing food until 1954, 9 years after the war had ended. That's how deep the financial wounds ran. Churchill once said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." And he did. His 6-volume history of the Second World War cemented his image as the indomitable hero who saved civilization. But behind that myth lies a quieter truth. Churchill was also the man who mortgaged Britain's future for its survival. He saved the body of the empire, but not its soul. And perhaps that was inevitable, because wars aren't just fought for freedom or democracy, they're fought for control over credit, trade, and currency. World War II wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a transfer of financial power from London to Washington, from the pound to the dollar, from Churchill to Roosevelt. To understand just how total that transfer was, look at what happened in the decades after. By the 1950s, the United States controlled 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. The dollar became the global reserve currency. Oil, commodities, and international loans were all priced in dollars. Britain, meanwhile, had to devalue its own currency twice, first in 1949, then again in 1967. Each time, the illusion cracked a little more. Each time, the empire's financial skeleton showed through the flesh. And here's the bitter irony. The same man who restored the pound to gold in 1925 and who once symbolized British financial strength had set in motion the events that ensured its demise. Churchill's economic choices were always rooted in image, in the belief that power looked like gold, prestige, empire. But in reality, power had already shifted to whoever controlled credit. And that wasn't Britain anymore. But perhaps the most haunting part of this story isn't economic, it's psychological. Churchill understood war, but not peace. He understood glory, but not debt. Like many great men, he was addicted to crisis. He thrived in moments of danger, but faltered in moments of accounting. And Britain, under his influence, inherited that same addiction, a national psyche that equated struggle with purpose and ignored the slow decay beneath the surface. When the guns were silent, the debt remained. When the empire waved its flags, its balance sheets whispered the truth. Britain had become what America would one day become, a power living off borrowed time and borrowed money. So what can you learn from this? Because this story isn't just about Churchill or Britain, it's about a pattern that repeats through history. You see it in Rome when the denarius was debased to fund endless wars. You see it in Spain when New World silver inflated its economy into ruin. You see it in the United States today with a national debt past 30 trillion and counting. Each empire believes it's different. Each believes its currency will hold, its allies will stay loyal, its debts will be manageable. And each discovers, too late, that the laws of finance are harsher than the laws of war. You can win every battle and still lose the world. When you look at Churchill today, the statues, the films, the quotes, you see a man carved in stone, frozen in triumph, but you rarely see the ledgers, the numbers, the IOUs signed in his era that would take half a century to pay. The empire didn't fall in 1945 because of defeat, it fell because of debt. And in that sense, Churchill's greatest victory and greatest failure are the same event. He saved Britain's honor, but sold its solvency. He won the war, but lost the peace. He kept the flag flying, but at a cost no one wanted to count. In the end, every nation faces the same choice Churchill did: prestige or prudence, image or reality, illusion or truth. Churchill chose illusion, and so do we. We live in economies propped up by credit, in nations drowning in deficit, in systems addicted to appearances. We tell ourselves we're strong, but the numbers say otherwise. And when the next great crisis comes, when currencies wobble, when allies falter, when debt turns to desperation, the question will return, just as it did in 1940. Who will save us? And at what cost? Because maybe the real lesson of Churchill's untold story isn't that he was a hero or a villain. It's that even heroes can bankrupt their nations if they mistake glory for solvency. And that's the truth history forgets, but your future can't afford to.